I knew Stephen for more than 30 years before that night in October. We'd first met when we were both young men, back in the days when ambition seemed to drive everything we did. Stephen had this easy way about him, a mix of charm and stubborn focus that turned heads and opened doors. Even back then, you could tell he had something special. We were both working in broadcasting, though he always had bigger dreams than I did. I was content to manage the local station, but Stephen, he was already looking for ways to build something that would last. And he did. When he finally won that bid in the late 70s and started his own television company, I was one of the first he called. He wanted me there for the grand opening, proud as a man could be. I watched him build that life piece by piece. The mansion in Austin was the crown jewel, big, elegant, filled with everything a man could want after decades of hard work. But what I remember most about that house wasn't the marble floors or the fancy furniture. It was the warmth. The way his wife, Alice, would greet you at the door, her voice as soft and welcoming as the smile on her face. The way Stephen would put his hand on your shoulder, lead you straight to the kitchen like you were family. When Alice passed in '93, it was like the light went out in that house. Stephen tried to keep going, but you could see the loneliness in the way he'd stand by the window in the evenings, just staring out at the garden like he was waiting for her to come back. I'd stop by more often after that, just to keep him company. We'd sit in his study, sipping bourbon, talking about the old days. But there was an emptiness to those talks that hadn't been there before. Then came Celeste. I remember the first time I met her. It was a warm afternoon in late '94. I'd come by to drop off some papers for Stephen, and she was there in the foyer, smiling that bright, practiced smile. She was polite, quick to offer coffee, but there was something about her eyes, sharp, always moving, like she was sizing up everything and everyone around her. Stephen introduced her as the new housekeeper. Said she'd come from a local country club, that she'd had a rough start in life but was working hard to turn things around. I wanted to believe him. Stephen was a generous man, always wanting to help people find their footing. But even then, I had a feeling. Call it an instinct or just the weight of years watching people, but there was something about Celeste that didn't sit right with me. She was too smooth, too quick to make herself indispensable. Still, Stephen was smiling more again. He had that old spark in his eyes when he talked about her, how she was helping him get the house in order, how she made him feel less alone. I didn't want to take that from him, so I held my tongue even when the rumors started. Over the next year, I watched them grow closer. Celeste wasn't just cleaning the house anymore. She was spending evenings with him, taking long walks in the garden, sharing quiet meals by candlelight. Stephen would tell me how she made him feel young again, how she'd brought life back into that empty mansion. I tried to be happy for him. He'd lost so much when Alice died. If this woman could fill that void, who was I to stand in the way? But every time I looked into her eyes, I felt that same flicker of unease. I told myself I was being foolish, that it wasn't my place to question how two people found comfort in each other. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that Celeste was there for more than just companionship. I didn't know then how deep her hold on him ran, or how far she'd be willing to go to make sure she kept it. But I learned soon enough. When Stephen told me he was going to marry Celeste, I tried to act like it was just another bit of news. I nodded, raised my glass, said the things you're supposed to say when an old friend tells you he's found happiness again. But deep down, I felt something cold settle in my gut. The wedding was in February of '95. A small gathering, just a few of us in that big house. I remember the day clear as anything, the way the winter sun cut through the windows, the hush that seemed to hang over everything. Stephen was beaming, of course, proud and full of that boyish charm he'd never lost. Celeste stood beside him, smiling in that careful way of hers, her hand resting lightly on his arm. I stood near the back, watching the two of them. I couldn't help but notice the way some of Stephen's old friends looked at her, polite smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes, quiet nods that said more than words ever could. It wasn't my place to judge, so I didn't say anything. But the feeling that something was off never left me. After the ceremony, there was a small reception. Stephen was in his element, moving from group to group, making sure everyone felt welcome. He'd always been good at that, turning any gathering into something warm and easy. But I kept catching glimpses of Celeste on the edges of the room, her eyes flicking this way and that, never quite resting on anyone for too long. A few days later, Stephen called me up and asked me to come by. He said he wanted to talk about some business, but I could tell there was more to it. When I got there, he led me into his study and closed the door. He looked tired, older somehow, like the weight of everything had settled on his shoulders all at once. He told me about the prenuptial agreement, how his lawyer had insisted on it. Just to be safe, he said. In case things don't work out. I nodded, though I could see he didn't really believe there'd ever be a need for it. He wanted so badly to think the best of her. That was just who Stephen was. He'd always given people the benefit of the doubt, even when they didn't deserve it. Over the next few years, I saw less of him than I used to. He'd call sometimes, invite me over for dinner, but it was different. There was a stiffness in the air that hadn't been there before. Celeste was always polite, always smiling, but it felt like she was watching everything, even when she wasn't saying a word. Stephen started talking more about his health around that time. He said Celeste was worried about him, that she convinced him to see a doctor for the first time in years. She had him on a strict diet, cutting out everything he used to love. He said it was good for him, that he felt better. But every time I saw him, he looked thinner, his face a little more hollow. I asked him once if he was happy. He just smiled, that same old smile, and told me not to worry so much. I've got everything I need, he said. She takes good care of me. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to think he'd found something real with her, that he wasn't just another lonely man trying to fill a space no one else could see. But the feeling in my gut never went away. Sometimes I'd see them in town, Stephen's hand resting on her shoulder, her laughter just a little too bright. People would look at them, and then glance away, like they didn't want to be caught staring. And I'd find myself wondering if anyone else saw what I saw, the way she always seemed to be just a step ahead, always in control. I didn't know then how close it all was to falling apart. I didn't know how much danger he was in, or how far she'd already gone to make sure he never saw the truth. The first few years after Stephen and Celeste married seemed calm on the surface. Stephen still hosted the occasional dinner, though not as often as before. When he did, the house had a different feel to it. It was still beautiful, still full of everything a man could want, but there was a quiet there I didn't remember from the old days. Celeste took to her role quickly. She kept the house in order, made sure Stephen ate right and rested when he was supposed to, or at least that's how it looked. She'd greet me at the door with that same polite smile, offer me coffee or tea, and then disappear into the kitchen to let us talk. Stephen never complained. He'd tell me how lucky he was to have found someone like her, how she took care of everything so he could focus on the things he loved. He'd always been a man who thrived on routine, the station, his garden, his books. Celeste made sure he never had to worry about the details. But even though things seemed settled, there were changes I couldn't help but notice. Stephen had always been a big man, broad-shouldered and confident. Over time, he started to look smaller somehow, his frame leaner, his clothes hanging looser. He said it was the diet Celeste had him on, that it was doing him good. And maybe it was, for a while. I still stopped by to see him, though not as often as I used to. The house was quiet in a way that made me feel like a guest instead of a friend. Celeste was always in the background, never far from where we sat. She'd refill our glasses without being asked, her eyes always moving, always watching. I didn't think much of it then, just figured it was her way of keeping things running. Stephen would talk about the things he used to do, the radio station days, the deals he'd made, the people he'd known. He'd always had a good memory for stories, and when he talked, it was like the years melted away. But every once in a while, he'd pause, his hand resting on the arm of his chair, and I'd catch a look in his eyes that was hard to read. We didn't talk about the marriage much. I'd ask how things were going, and he'd give me that same easy smile, the one that said he didn't want to get into it. I didn't push. After all the years we'd known each other, I figured if he had something he wanted to say, he would. Sometimes he'd mention little things, like how Celeste had taken over more and more of the household, how she was always the one talking to the contractors, the gardeners, even his lawyer. He didn't sound upset about it, just matter of fact. Stephen had always liked to have someone else handle the details, and Celeste seemed happy to take on the role. As for me, I kept my opinions to myself. I'd seen enough to know that no one really knows what goes on behind closed doors. It wasn't my place to judge, and Stephen never gave me any reason to think he wasn't happy. Life went on that way for a few years. The seasons changed, the leaves fell and grew again, and the quiet around that house seemed to settle in deeper. Stephen and I would still talk, though not as often. Our conversations were comfortable, full of old memories and new silences. Looking back, I can see how easy it was to miss the signs. But at the time, it just felt like two old friends growing older, sharing what they could, and leaving the rest unspoken. By the late summer of '99, things in Stephen's house seemed different. It was hard to put a finger on. He still called from time to time, still had that polite warmth in his voice, but there was a distance there too. Like he was tired, or maybe just distracted. I remember one visit in particular. It was a humid afternoon in August, I stopped by to drop off a book I thought he'd like. When he opened the door, he looked frail. Not just thinner, but like the air itself was pressing down on him. He said he'd been having some trouble with his heart. Nothing serious, he assured me. Just the usual complaints of an old man. Celeste was there, of course. She hovered in the doorway behind him, her smile tight and her hand resting on his shoulder like she was holding him up. She thanked me for the book, said he'd been needing something new to read. But her eyes never quite met mine. We sat in the den for a while, talking about small things. Stephen's garden, the way the city was growing around us. He didn't bring up anything serious, and neither did I. It felt like we were both avoiding something neither of us wanted to name. When I got up to leave, Celeste walked me to the door. She was friendly, almost too friendly. Asked if there was anything she could get me before I left. I told her no, thanked her for the offer. But as I stepped out onto the porch, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house itself was holding its breath. A few weeks later, Stephen called me up. He sounded weaker on the phone, his words a little slower. He said Celeste was taking good care of him, that she was making sure he took his medicine, ate the right things. I told him I was glad to hear it. What else was there to say? In those last weeks, I didn't see much of him. Work kept me busy, and Stephen said he was resting more. He'd always been a man who liked to keep moving, but now he talked about how he spent whole days in bed, just reading or napping. I wish I'd pushed harder to see him then. But it's easy to wish for things when you already know how the story ends. The night of October 2nd, I was woken up by the sound of sirens. I didn't think much of it at first. Sirens come and go, even in our part of town. But the next morning, I heard what had happened. Stephen had called 911 himself. Said he was hurt, that he didn't want to die. The papers said he was holding his own insides in his hands, trying to keep himself together until help came. I can't pretend to know what went through his mind in those last moments. The Stephen I knew was a fighter, a man who'd built everything he had from nothing. I like to think he was still fighting then, even when everything else had been taken from him. The police said Celeste was arrested later that night, that she'd tried to make it look like something else, but the evidence was clear. I didn't see her again after that. I didn't want to. All I know is that the house that had once been a place of laughter and warmth was left empty and cold. The kind of quiet that seeps into the walls and never really leaves. The days after Stephen's death felt like a fog had settled over everything. The newspapers ran headlines about the murder, but the stories never seemed to catch what the rest of us felt. The emptiness, the disbelief. Stephen had always been larger than life, the kind of man who filled up every room he entered. To think he'd been left like that, alone and bleeding, was more than I could take in. The police came to talk to me again, asking if I'd seen or heard anything in the days before. I told them what I could, the phone calls, the way he'd sounded tired. I didn't have much more to offer. It wasn't like he'd ever told me he was scared or worried. If he had, I would have done something. At least, I like to think I would have. The investigation moved quickly. They said Celeste had confessed, that she'd tried to make it look like he'd hurt himself, but it didn't add up. There were too many things she couldn't explain away, the angle of the wounds, the fingerprints, the trail of blood. I didn't need to hear all the details. It was enough to know that the woman who'd promised to take care of him had been the one to take everything from him. The trial was in the papers for months. I didn't go. Couldn't bring myself to sit there and watch them turn Stephen's life into evidence and arguments. But I read enough to know how it ended. She was found guilty, sentenced to life without parole. Some said it was justice. Others said there's no justice in something like that, just an ending no one wanted. I kept my distance from it all. There were reporters who came around, wanting to know what I thought, how I felt. I didn't have anything to give them. Stephen had been my friend, and he was gone. That was all that mattered to me. The house sat empty for a long time after. The new owners didn't come for months. When they did, they put up new curtains and repainted the porch. But every time I drove past, I still saw Stephen standing at the window, the way he used to when he was waiting for Alice to come home. I thought about him a lot in those days. About how he'd built that house with love and filled it with laughter. About how he'd trusted Celeste, even when some of us weren't sure. Stephen always believed in second chances. Maybe that was his greatest strength, and the thing that doomed him in the end. Some nights I'd sit on my porch, coffee cooling in my hands, and watch the lights go on in that house across the street. It looked like any other home, but I knew better. I knew the weight of the memories that lingered there. People like to think they'd see it coming, that there'd be a sign, some warning that tells you when something's gone wrong. But the truth is, most of the time there isn't. You just wake up one day and find out that the world you thought you knew isn't there anymore. It's been years now, and still there are days when I expect to see Steven walking up my driveway, ready to share a story or ask about some small thing that didn't matter to anyone but us. It's a habit I can't quite shake, listening for his knock, looking for his smile. But the house across the street is quiet, and the man who made it a home is gone. People like to talk about closure. They say it's important to find a way to put things to rest. But the truth is, there are some things you don't ever really move on from. You just learn to carry them with you. The weight of what happened and the memories of what came before. I think about the first time I met Celeste sometimes. How polite she was, how careful. It's easy, looking back, to see all the small moments that added up to something terrible. But at the time, it just felt like life. Complicated and messy and full of choices that don't always make sense until it's too late. I don't have any big answers or grand theories about why she did what she did. I'm not sure anyone does. I only know what I saw. A man who wanted to believe in love again, and a woman who saw an opportunity. Steven was a good man. Kind, generous, trusting. Maybe that's why he didn't see the danger until it was too late. These days, the house has new owners. They've made it theirs in ways that have nothing to do with Steven or Celeste. I hope they've found some peace in those rooms, some sense of safety. But I know that for me, it'll always be the place where my friend lost everything. Sometimes, when the night is quiet and the world feels still, I let myself remember the way it used to be. Steven's laughter, the warm lights spilling out of the windows, the feeling that anything was possible. I hold on to that. Because in the end, that's what stays. Not the violence, not the betrayal, but the small, steady kindness that defined him. That's the story I choose to remember. The man he was, not the way he died. And maybe that's the best any of us can do. Carry the good with us, and let the rest settle into the past.